Hello and welcome to the Mighty Oaks Show. It is great to have you with us today. Looking forward to a fantastic conversation, and we've had a good week here at the Mighty Oaks Foundation. Before we get started, I'll remind you, as I do every week, if you have not yet, go to our YouTube channel, subscribe there, and also hit the notification bell. That lets you know when more content comes online. We've produced so much content in the last month, and we want you to be aware of all of that. Later on this year, we'll put out a documentary for the Mighty Oaks Foundation, and that will be posted a number of places, but also on our channel. So every time we push something out, it's on our YouTube channel. Make sure you're subscribed and that you have hit the notification bell so that you are alerted when new content comes online. You can also, again, of course, leave a question, leave a comment, share the content out. That would be fantastic. If you're listening to the podcast or listening rather at Mojo 50, thank you for doing that. Take some time when we're done today. Jump over to YouTube, search for the Mighty Oaks Foundation, and you can follow us there. And that would be awesome. We've had some good things happen over the last couple of weeks. If you watched our show just a couple of weeks ago, it was a recap of our Mighty Oaks Foundation Gala, and what an incredible event. And if you haven't watched that, go and check that out. Colonel Alan West was our guest speaker there. We also talked about the foundation and so many other things that are going on, and you'll want to check that out. One of the things that Chad talked about during our gala was the Faith-Based Veteran Service Alliance, FBVSA. It's a lot of letters. It's a long title, but that is an alliance of faith-based veterans organizations like Mighty Oaks and others. And today we have one of those on with us. Reboot Recovery is an organization that we here at the Mighty Oaks Foundation have been talking about for a number of years. We have what I would call a loose partnership. It's friends helping each other. Reboot Combat Recovery does what we don't do. We do what they don't do, but together we're able to really hit the whole spectrum of veteran care and trauma care. And really thankful to be able to have this conversation with Evan Owens. Evan is the executive director of Reboot Combat Recovery. He and his wife Jenny founded Reboot. And man, we should have talked about this a long time ago. I was thinking before I asked you to come on that you had already been on because we've talked so much.
Sure.
But not in this venue. So thanks for joining me, man.
This is awesome. No, I'm excited. This is good. And those of you listening, I'm excited. I mean, a full 3 hours that you've given me to share my story. I mean, that's going to be amazing.
Yeah. It will be interesting, particularly when I get up after an hour and walk away and you're still talking. It's going to be great. Oh, man. I'm always happy when we get to an hour. But yeah, we got a lot to say and a lot to talk about. Evan, a lot of people certainly are connected to Reboot and use Reboot products, but a lot of the people who would watch this show or particularly listen on Mojo and through the podcast would not know about Reboot. So why don't you start at the beginning? Talk about you and your wife, where you started, and why you would start an organization like this one.
Yeah, no, thanks for letting me share. I'll try to get through the history quickly. My wife, she's a doctor of occupational therapy. She specialized in traumatic brain injury, stroke rehabilitation, things like that. And she was working at what's called the Stallworth Center, which is part of Vanderbilt University Medical Center. And it just so happened they had just signed a contract with the Department of Defense to handle overflow patients from Fort Campbell, which is about 45 minutes north of Nashville, Tennessee, where we lived. And within only a few patients, I think she realized that this is what she wanted to be doing, that dealing with blast injuries, dealing with mild traumatic brain injury was where her skill set could be best applied. And it just so happened one of her early patients was a sergeant major who was asked to be on the steering committee for building the first traumatic brain injury clinic of its kind on an active military base. And they recruited my wife to go work up there. And so we packed up our bags, we moved north of the city towards Fort Campbell. I knew right away that I was in an all-military neighborhood because I was the only person that didn't drive a truck, didn't own a Jeep, and I went to work at a reasonable time, like 7 a.m. in the morning, right, as opposed to everyone else who was already gone by like 5. And so one thing led to another. I was leading a technology company. I was a CEO of a growing technology company in Nashville and was really enjoying that. And my wife began to recognize there was a gap in healing for the people that she was servicing. And specifically, that is what a lot of your listeners will know was a faith-based gap. There was nothing, no one was talking about soul injury, soul healing, soul wounds. Nobody was talking about that. And so really we began inviting people into our home We started having conversations about where faith and trauma collide. We would serve up some lukewarm, mediocre spaghetti, but have these deep, intense conversations, and word began to spread. And that was really the origin. That was the beginning of what Reboot Recovery would become. And we didn't know it at the time. We didn't intend on it to happen, but God had other plans, and awesome things began to happen.
When you talk about soul injury, what are you talking about specifically? That's a phrase that you and I would understand. A lot of people may not.
Yeah, I think we're just talking about things that violate what we know was always meant to be. The Bible says that God put eternity in our hearts. I think we were never meant to experience death and decay and destruction the way that we have. And so there's an alarm that goes off inside of us. Something hurts, something's wounded inside of us when we come face to face with the evil that sin has done in the world. And so we always say, if trauma is your personal intersection with the brokenness of the world, then recovery is your personal intersection with the redemptive heart of God. And that's what we're referring about when we talk about soul injury or soul woundedness.
One of the interesting, I think, components to what we do is that we would define ourselves as exclusively faith-based. And what we mean by that is there's not a clinical component to what the Mighty Oaks Foundation does. We approach PTSD, trauma, whether it's related to combat or military service or just life. We approach all of that from a creation standpoint, but what we try to be clear on is that there are clinical responses to those things that are helpful. We're not against those, we're not fighting against those, but we believe, as you just articulated, that there has to be a faith component, and really that has to be probably the foundation before the rest of it can work. Your wife coming from a very clinical setting, can you talk about how the two of those do interact, how they work together? And again, I think you have the church side sometimes, which is it's all about the Bible. There is nothing else. Then you have the clinical world, which it's all about the clinical, which can be therapy, it can be medication, it can be a lot of different things. The faith is just an unnecessary distraction, but really there has to be an interaction. Can you talk about that and how that works, what that looks like?
Yeah, so I mean, we're of the mindset that all truth, if it's true, then it's God's truth, right? I mean, if it's a true thing, then it's God's truth. And so we're of that mindset. And so what we have found is that, and anybody who has studied behavioral psychology or anything in that realm, cognitive processing theory, any of these kind of things, will find that there's so many things that in recent years, recent, I say in the last 80 years, 50 years, people have come to discover about the way that the human mind responds to things and the way that the mind and body respond to trauma, that if you look in Scripture, those truths are already there. And so I think in a lot of ways, what we're seeing is that the medical world is more scientifically, more data, more maybe even descriptively describing or defining things that have been around for generations and generations, maybe even since the dawn of time. And even if you look up this idea of trauma, we see this word trauma in the earliest parts of Scripture. Like in Genesis chapter 3, we see the original words that eventually lead to the translation of the word trauma that we use, all the way dating back. You see it throughout the New Testament. And so I think that a lot of times it takes us a little bit longer as a human race to catch up to things that God already knew. And I think I'm excited to see how we're seeing the world of clinical and the world of spiritual sort of coming together. And hopefully God and Christ are at the center of where those two roads diverge and where they actually meet.
What do you say to people that talk about like the integrated method of therapy when they talk? Normally when you hear about integration, it's almost in a pejorative sense. People who would be, Christian people, people who consider themselves very strongly people of faith, but approaching everything from a biblical perspective, particularly when you talk about the sufficiency of Scripture and all those things. How do you address that to a Christian audience, the need for what you just described?
Yeah, I think that anybody who's been a Christian for very long will know that faith is not something that plays out by itself. Right? That we need other people, that we can't be the best versions of ourselves by ourselves. We need other people in that circle. And I think that circle needs to include some people whose full-time job it is to sit around and discuss things about how does the human mind and body respond to stressors and to trauma. And while there's a lot of expertise on theological circles who can respond about how do we spiritually deal with the impact of those events, how do we reconcile the evil of the world versus the fall of man versus all, those are all good things. And we need those people in our circle who maybe have a deeper expertise because they've just spent more time deep diving those. And again, I don't think it's a replacement. I think sometimes we almost view it as like you're either going to do this or this, and it's a both and strategy. And for a lot of people, I think the rub is also that sometimes I think the mental health world has been a little bullish in that they've started to almost view it's like, spirituality is great. It's part of an overall healthy mental state. It's like, no. That's not how it is. It's not like mental health is the king and everybody sits underneath it, including spirituality. And sometimes that's where I think that rub and that friction has come from, is maybe a little bit of a condescending attitude and or a judgmental attitude from both sides.
I try to describe that interplay sometimes this way. Clinician would say we start with the clinical, we start with the medical, and we work our way toward faith if that's necessary. And our approach would be the opposite of that. We start with faith, we approach it from the spiritual, and then get to the clinical if that's necessary. But it may be necessary. It's on a continuum that we have to understand exists.
And to that point, Jeremy, I mean, when we first started Reboot in our living room, right? I mean, you got to remember, this is not a big deal.
Right.
We would have these families coming over who they had tons of access to clinical solutions.
Right.
I mean, they were going to more appointments. I remember visiting one of the guys' houses. He had shoe boxes full of medications he was taking every day. Shoe boxes full.
Yeah.
And I think the nerve that we struck early on was this conversation about how does it impact our soul. And I think people recognized that in spite of all the mental and physical healing, there was something intangible, something more core to who they were that had been impacted and damaged, and they needed to figure out what that was. And hardly any of the people that we served early on, and I would say the vast majority we still serve, are not people of faith. And that's something that really, I think, separates Reboot from some other maybe more church, centric programs.
Right.
We work with churches, but we work to reach people who are outside the walls of churches. And I can talk about that model a little bit more, but I think we approach it in a conversation that is through a questioning kind of, I forget what that's called. There's the method, whatever, through asking lots of different questions.
Yeah.
We're able to kind of guide people into this thought of like, well, maybe I do have a soul. And if I have a soul, well, then who put it there? And if it's there and it's wounded, well, then who could fix it? Well, the original manufacturer of my soul could fix it, God. And, you kind of go through this logic building process. And so it's really beautiful.
Yeah. One of the things that's helped us is just time and research. And we have understood, things like traumatic brain injury, although the symptoms may mirror post-traumatic stress or trauma-related, soul injuries, there is an actual biological, organic component to that. And these are things we haven't understood and we're beginning to understand, and it's been, very helpful. I've had many conversations, as I'm sure you have, with amputees, folks who have lost limbs in combat and struggled severely physically. What's interesting, and a lot of people don't understand, is there's a very spiritual component to that as well. If you lose a limb, if you're struggling physically, there is a spiritual struggle that takes place. And the number of people who end their life after a long process of fighting with physical injury, the number of people is very high. And what you realize from that is it requires medical professionals to deal with the physical, and then others who get the medical part but can then point them to the answer for the spiritual struggles they're having as well. And I don't think it's different than that when we're talking about the issues that you and I deal with.
Yeah, one of the things I say when I do a lot of my speaking, I say trauma catalyzes a conversation about faith, because when we witness the evil of the world firsthand, it forces us to ask questions of why do bad things happen. It forces those existential questions. And that's why I think it's great for organizations like Mighty Oaks and Reboot to be able to be there to guide people through some of those questions that are really, really tough, that I think if we don't ask, we miss out on the goodness on the other side of the answers. Yeah,
that's good. You mentioned that you work to reach outside of kind of the church circle and minister to people who may not be church people or Christian people. Mighty Oaks and Reboot are very similar in that regard. We have always been very careful and very deliberate to come alongside the church, but not to try to replace the church or be the church. We're faith-based in that we approach all of this from a faith position, from a creation position. But the reason we have access to so much of the active duty community, and the reason we have access to people who hate God, don't believe in God, whatever, is because we don't start there. We start with, there is an answer. It's probably different than the one that you've been struggling to find. You've tried just about everything else and you haven't found what you're looking for. Why don't you let us help you? And we start with light conversations about faith and work our way to heavier, deeper conversations about faith. and that's given us access as well. Talk about what you guys do, and I think it's an interesting approach that you will start groups in churches. You will, but that's not your preferred place to start a group. Can you talk about that a little bit and how that works?
Yeah, I mean, so the way Reboot works, Reboot is a community first and a course second. So all of our groups are 12 weeks long. They meet one night per week. And as Jeremy just said, they meet in every place from active duty military basements to church basements to apartment clubhouses to office buildings, right? We've got nearly 300 course locations around the country. Each course is led by volunteers. So if you're listening today and you say, you know what, I want to do more than play in a golf tournament or send a check to another nonprofit. I actually want to do something about it personally. I want to be part of a solution. Reboot might be a great place to start, right? And so you could contact us, work through our training process. You could become one of our course facilitators. There's about 1,200 to 1,500 course facilitators any given week who are helping lead courses in communities just like the people who are listening right now. And so each course is 10 to 15 people big, typically. Sometimes they're a little larger, 20, 25, but usually about that 10 to 15. And you work through our curriculum, and our curriculum gives you everything you need to be able to facilitate this course. And the great part about it is we say it's a community first and a course second, because this doesn't happen, somewhere else. This happens in the context of their regular living. And so the people they go through the course with will continue to be in their world. They're going to play on the same little league team. They're going to go to the same, schools, go to the same churches, whatever it may be. So there's this built-in accountability. Equally, when people graduate, they're encouraged to become leaders, and most of them do. A majority of people stay involved in a Reboot program somehow in their local community, saying, yes, I found purpose in my pain. Now I'm ready to help other people out of a dark valley they might find themselves in. And so, we work with a lot of local churches to host our courses, meaning we use their facilities, which is fantastic because we do like to provide meals and childcare at our courses. But we also enjoy having courses outside in the world that are maybe a little bit less threatening to people who are not Christian people, who aren't churchgoers. But we do like to have a church who's sort of involved, because we like to be able to have some place for these people to plug into and continue growing in other areas of their faith, because we just talk about trauma. We don't talk about marriage relationships as much, or addiction or finance or discipleship, or some of these other things that obviously a church might be more well equipped to guide someone through. And so, so that's how our model works. And it's been incredible that in only a few years, it grew from my living room to all these courses because of our amazing volunteers. It's really been amazing. You
allow husbands and wives, in fact, you encourage husbands and wives to attend groups together, which again is a little bit different than what we do. It's a different kind of focus or emphasis. Yeah. But can you talk about that? I think that's helpful because that breaks down some barriers to attending a group by yourself.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult for caregivers and spouses and people like that to be able to help when they don't have a shared experience or a shared language with the veteran or with the first responder. And I think so many times there's language issues, there's linguistic issues that create a gap where somebody goes and they experience all this personal growth and the other one feels left behind. Well, in our course, we really believe the two are one flesh. So we want to give them a shared experience where they're able to work through healing together. We believe that the best ally, the best chance for this person long-term experiencing healing is found in the context of a loving, trusting relationship. And if that person can be their spouse plus the members in their group, well, then what better accountability can I have? I know in my life, there's so many times where my wife helps spur me on to make better decisions, to be a better man than I would be without her. And so she really is my ally for this fight that I'm in. And we want them to be able to have some shared lessons that they, when I'm having a rough day, she can go reference chapter 6 and be like, hey, remember when in Reboot we were talking about fill in the blank? Right. And we both have that knowledge. And that's the way the course works. And we're fortunate also, a lot of our leaders are married couples, which is really a cool dynamic for them to be able to have the same journey that Jenny and I had. Yeah,
that's awesome. As you work with churches and as you work with organizations, the partnership piece has become more important to you. You and I started talking, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, about, even us working together and some of the things you were doing. But you have really leaned in, your organization has really leaned into the idea of partnership, producing resources outside of your normal curriculum and all the stuff that you're doing. Yeah. What was the process of what was the decision-making process? I'm trying to think through, try to ask the question. What was the decision-making process that you went through from we're just going to hold our thing to we're going to continue to develop and broaden our scope and broaden our reach and broaden our connections?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. So the first is, we used to get asked a lot, well, is Reboot a veteran service organization, or is Reboot a first responder? And I've always said, no, we're a trauma healing organization. We help people overcome trauma. And it just so happened that God birthed this idea working in the veteran culture. But anyone who is awake right now sees that trauma is contagious and it's spreading. And so we feel like we've been given a special message that can really help people overcome trauma in whatever context and background they came from. And so we're going to continue that journey. Veterans are always going to hold the most, primary spot in my heart because they're the people that allowed me and gave me the grace to be able to work with them, and in many ways accepted me as an outsider into that world. And I'd love to share that later. But I think, and they taught me more than I taught them for sure. But I think for us, the other reason why partnerships make so much sense for us is, we're not, we're kind of a big commitment by a course participant, right? So if I'm a veteran and I'm hurting, I've got to say I'm going to commit 12 weeks of my life. I'm going to drag my spouse in here. And there's no cool. We don't take people, hiking or camping or fishing or hunting, or we don't do any of that stuff. It's literally you're going to come into this room and you're going to dig up some of the messiest, toughest parts of your life, and it's going to be one of the hardest things you've ever done for 12 weeks. Would you like to sign up for free? That's the ask. Right. And so we don't have a lot of bells and whistles, and so we're a great long-term aftercare solution to a lot of other nonprofits who are really good at the tip of the spear, intentional sort of intensive interventions. That's not what we do. We're more about the long-term community engagement, and that's where we feel like that's where our heart is and where our gifting is and where maybe we can be best used. And so I don't want to be anybody else. I want to just do what we do and let Mighty Oaks do what you guys do best, and Soul Survivor do what they do best, et cetera, on down the line. Yeah. And plus we look up to you guys and a lot of other organizations that I feel like we can always learn what are things that we can be doing better. How can we do better at outreach? How can we do better at fundraising? How can we do better at growing a network of advisors? I mean, all those things are things you guys do really well that encourage us, inspire us, and motivate us for sure.
I think there were, I want to say 4 different organizations, yours, ours, and a couple of others that started about the same time. And early on, I think we were all trying to do everything because we all thought, we could do it and hit every wicket and do everything. But we've all matured together, I think, to understand we have to work together to make this happen. And that's where the Service Alliance came from. That's where a lot of these conversations have continued to develop. And I think our whole community is better because of it, because we've decided we're just going to work together. We'll focus on what we're good at and let other people do what they're good at.
Right. Yeah, I got plenty of work to do. I don't need more jobs right now.
Sure.
I'm good.
Right. That's us too. Yeah. Every time I try to do something different, I'm like, why are we doing this? I don't understand. There's other people doing this. The military community and the first responder community, 2 communities that you serve, are both notoriously difficult to break into, and there are a lot of reasons for that. We could talk about all of those. Very few people do very well ministering to those communities who don't come from one of those communities. Share your journey there a little bit. I'd be really interested to hear how you overcame that, because I have a hard time sometimes. Yeah.
I mean, I'm wearing a pink shirt for an interview. It looks like I'm wearing makeup, I think, because of the lights in my office right now. So no, I was a music major in college. I went to go work for a technology company as a business professional. Of people that you would think this guy probably is going to end up doing military ministry, I had to be like way down the list. I don't own a Jeep. I don't drive motorcycles. I'm kind of a coward. I don't enjoy working out. None of the things that alpha males are typically known for. And so, no doubt, when we first got into doing this, I mean, there was no chance I was going to overstep my bounds because I didn't even know what to say. I just asked open-ended questions and listened a lot. And somewhere along the way, here's a few things that I learned. I learned that I had known friendship, but that the level of brotherhood that you experience in the military is something that I don't fully understand, but I've had moments that have given me snapshots of why people who identify as a veteran so deeply. And I'd love to share one of those in a minute. So that was one thing. Number two is I had to get out there and immerse myself fully in the culture. And so people might laugh, but for a couple days a week, this is while I was still the CEO of a tech company. So imagine this, I'm a CEO of an Inc. 5000 company. I'm wearing a suit and tie. Everybody knows me in Nashville. I take off my clothes. I put on a Reboot t-shirt and some shorts. I go up and I do passing out flyers in the PX during mealtime on a Tuesday night at Fort Campbell, where nobody wants to talk to me. Everybody is mean to me, and everybody is suspicious of me, thinking that somehow I'm doing this to get rich. And it was like, no, I'm doing the other thing to get rich. This is what I'm doing for, And so I think for me, not only was it humility, but it was also just me being really vulnerable and saying like, hey, I don't know, but would you tell me about your story? Tell me, I want to learn. And I think that really I think people are so used to everyone giving advice instead of grace. I think I led with grace, and I led with a listening ear, and I led with a little bit of truth as opposed to a lot of truth and advice up front. And I think that over time, my role has become really unimportant in terms of the face of the organization. I've worked really hard to make sure Jenny and I are always really invisible. And in the past year, that's changed some, not actually by our choice, but just because it has. We've become out front more. But I would venture to say that even last year, I could go to any Reboot group in the country and nobody knew who I was, because every face of the organization was a volunteer or a leader in the organization or a graduate. And that was the secret to Reboot. It's that Jenny and I never made it about us. If we would have made it about us as outsiders, we were doomed. It wasn't about what we could do at Fort Campbell. It was about what everybody else could do in their local communities. And I think the earlier on we made it about other people and not about us. We didn't draw any celebrity. We still are not into the celebrity, culture very much. It worked for us. And I think it's the only way it could have worked, quite honestly.
What are some of the stories that stick out? You said you had a couple. What are some of those that?
Well, I remember one, man. I mean, I'll get emotional talking about it. I haven't talked about it much, but, my wife and I had a series of miscarriages going on. So while we were teaching courses on trauma, we were dealing with some pretty intense traumas of our own. And I remember I was at Camp Lejeune standing up a group down there and working with a bunch of Marines. And I went to bed and I got a phone call at like 2 a.m. and my wife was crying, and she said, hey, I'm in the bathroom. I just passed out again. I'm having another miscarriage, whatever. So I'm helpless, so we call 911. The doors are locked. It's a whole mess. They had to get into the house, and she left the phone accidentally on. So I'm hearing the paramedics talk about her, but they don't know I'm listening. Right. And then it just goes silent, and I have no clue what's happened. Well, I come to find out that there had been, sorry for the listeners, but there had been blood and vomit and all kinds of other things throughout the home as she was being taken out. There were some complications with getting her out of the home and everything. And so through word of mouth traveled to a couple guys, Brandon and Jeff, who were in my Reboot course at the time. And they were actually some leaders who had kind of helped me along. And at 2 a.m. in the morning, Brandon woke up, got out of his bed, went and got dressed, drove up to my house, cleaned the entire house, went to the grocery store, got new groceries, filled up the refrigerator. And then went and visited my wife in the hospital as soon as he was done. And, for me, I think I had known friendship, but I'd never known brotherhood. And I remember reflecting on that and thinking, nobody does that. Nobody does that. And Brandon was unique in that because of combat, he was comfortable handling gross stuff that you needed to handle. And, he saved me so much trauma. Imagine if the next day I finally got a flight. I think I got home at 5. Imagine me walking in the door at 5 o'clock and then having to clean up the remnants of a miscarriage, et cetera. I mean, imagine how terrible that would be. And he saved me all that trauma. And I think that's what veterans do so many times. They save the rest of us the trauma by absorbing it themselves. And I think when I saw that, I just thought, that's Jesus. That's Jesus incarnate, and Jesus absorbing the trauma of the world to save the rest of us. That's Christ. That's what it looks like. And I don't think I ever got that until that day.
Do experiences like that help shape the decisions that you make going forward and who you'll serve and how you'll serve them?
It is the driving factor. I mean, I've said a million times, if it boils down to the future of the organization being, determined by something that Jenny and I want, then I should already quit my job. I mean, the people who matter most to us are the people who are like the Brandons. They're the people who have been through a whole lot ever since they were kids, and they've continually answered the call. And I think for us, it also helps keep us impassioned. I mean, you know this. There is a time and a place where the ministry is what you get to do, and you're doing that hands-on, messy ministry, and you're in the thick of it. And then there's the other 99% of the time where you're doing office administration and profit and loss statements to send to the board and all kinds of crap that you're like, this is not, if I wanted to do this, I could have stayed in the for-profit world. This is not what I want to do. And it only takes one of those every month or one of those every quarter for me to remember, like, oh yeah, this is why. This right here is why. And and I don't think about that particular story very often, but I think about so many others that are just these defining moments where, like I said, I feel like I learned more, I gained more, and still have gained more from the participants than they ever gained from me. Yeah. Tenfold, not even close.
I'd like to talk about some steps that you would recommend for someone that's dealt with trauma, some things that you teach and why those things are important in just a second. But before we talk about that, I'd like to talk about some of the evidence-based stuff that you guys put out. You do a great job, and I think a lot of this is your wife. Does just a tremendous job of
all of it. All of it is my wife.
Yeah.
No, all of it is my wife.
You are wearing a pink shirt. I didn't want to say anything, but I'm gonna.
Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you. There it is. Perfect. I knew it was coming.
But I think because of her background and her understanding of just data, you guys do a tremendous job of proving that what you do works, and for our community, demonstrating that the faith solutions work. For those that might struggle with that, can you just run off some basic, statistics, some data that you use to say this is how we know that the faith solution works in this environment?
Yeah, Jenny would definitely do a better job, and you're right. So those of you listening, my wife has a background in research, which was a major secret weapon that we tapped into. And we always wanted to sort of, and I hope this is taken in the heart that I mean it, we kind of wanted to go into the basketball court of mental health and play on their court with their ball using their rules and still show them that our model of faith outperformed or performed equally as well to theirs.
Right.
Not out of a spirit of competition, but just out of using language that they would understand. We wanted to be accepted by the mainstream mental health community. And that's not, most faith-based organizations don't care. They want to exist just with faith-based. We always wanted to be accepted. And so, things that we would highlight, I guess, would be, we use a lot of National Institute of Health, NIH scales to prove symptom reduction. So this is everything from anxiety to depression to pain interference to sleeplessness to fatigue to social isolation to a myriad of other things. We also use various measures that allow us to measure a person's connection with their spirituality in terms of their purpose, their sense of belonging, their sense of identity, their sense of mission, which is a key indicator in suicide prevention.
Yeah.
We use things like quality of life measures. Quality of life is basically just overall, how do you feel? And all of these tools for us have been great. They've been able to help us get published in various medical journals. And, Jenny is asked often to go speak. We have 3 kids that are 7 and under, so she doesn't travel much anymore. Right. But I think for us, the data points that we look to are some of those. However, I do want to just say that here's the bigger thing that I think our data is showing is that symptom presence or absence is a really poor indicator of long-term healing and health when it comes to post-traumatic stress. And I don't want to step outside.
Can you say that one more time?
Yeah, so that the presence or absence of symptoms is not necessarily a very good measurement of long-term health. And that is because anyone who's dealt with some type of prolonged illness or trauma can tell you that their symptoms will ebb and their symptoms will flow and their symptoms will come and their symptoms will go. And in that rhymed. I felt like Dr.
Yeah, that was
Seuss
great. Yeah, you did a good job.
But when their symptoms are doing this, I think that the difference maker is, are they able to live well in spite of those symptoms? Are they able to live a life of purpose and joy in spite of those symptoms? And that, to me, is what true healing looks like. And so I think part of what we get into is, what do we define healing as for a trauma victim? Because I think in the medical world, it's always going to be about symptom abatement and reduction.
Right.
And that's healing. But I think in a spiritual world, that's not how we define healing. We define healing differently. And so I think that's where some of the things that we have to help translate, and we have to say that in spite of these symptoms, we're giving people purpose, we're giving them a sense of belonging, we're giving them a sense of joy, a sense of mission. And those are things that, yes, we're over here proving symptom reduction, but no matter what we do, other than just endless amounts of trying different medications, the symptoms are going to come and go potentially. So that's how we kind of approach this topic of data.
Yeah, I like to use the phrase, there's a difference between how you feel and what's true.
Great.
And I think that there are people who will always feel bad. There will always be lingering symptoms. You know, we, in the early days, would talk about, you need to get over it, you need to move past it, you need to, and those are not helpful phrases, because you may never get over it, you may never get past it, you're certainly not going to forget it. And the question is, how do you move forward in spite of that, in a positive way, in a purpose-filled way, in a hope-filled way? So,
well, we always talk about like the burning bush. Like, this is part of our curriculum, but we talk about the burning bush. Like, you know, Moses saw a burning bush that wasn't consumed, and he never forgot it. And I think that's what a person who's living well in spite of trauma, they're like a burning bush. They're on fire, no doubt. Their life is very challenging, but they're not consumed by it.
Yeah, that's great.
And that's the word picture that I always go to.
Yeah, it's great.
See, I worked in some Bible, Jeremy, so people will know that I did read my Bible once. You see that? So for the Christians out there, I'm a real Christian. Okay, I know.
Well, you do live in Tennessee, so I think we'd all assume you're a Christian. I think
everybody is a Christian down here. Yeah, everybody. Is a Christian down here in Nashville. Yeah, no doubt. Yeah, 100%. 100%.
Let's talk about. Hope is really important to me. It's important to all of us, but we talk about hope. For you, I'll ask it this way instead of, what is hope or how do you give hope? What are some of the key factors in your curriculum and your program when someone comes to you, because it's not about necessarily being in the military or having served in law enforcement or in the first responder community. It's about dealing with trauma. What are some of the principles that you use, some of the things that you communicate to people to move beyond trauma?
Yeah, so I think, Romans says it best, where it talks about how hope is produced, and it's produced through perseverance. And I think that's the first counterpoint, is hope is not produced by numbing the symptoms and hoping the trauma goes away. Hope is actually produced through persevering through the trauma. And so the first thing we do is we create a safe place, a stable place for people to begin wading through the traumas that they've encountered. And I'd say that's the first place that we start, is creating that. And I think that safety is another important thing. I think, so many times what happens is we have this earthquake in our lives, and we quickly go to start. Imagine that we have an earthquake and I went to go patch the drywall or rearrange the furniture while the earthquake was still going on. Everybody would think I was crazy, but that's what we do a lot of times with our life. We're still shaking from the trauma, and we're busy rearranging furniture, making sure that we look good. And so I think we give people a structure of safety, stability, and support to be able to work through and persevere through that trauma. And then also to unpack all of the little traps that are laid for us along the way. And I think that, trauma, it makes all of us vulnerable to making decisions and choices that under normal circumstances, common circumstances, we wouldn't have made. And so I think that's the other piece of it, is, we create safety, stability, and support for them to process, and we help them make sure they don't do more harm to themselves than good in that process through poor decision making or things like that. And I know you've seen that as well, as people take 10 steps forward and then one decision puts them back worse than they were when they began, and it's just devastating to watch.
You have 12 weeks of instruction. What are some of the topics that you cover in those 12 weeks?
Yeah, no, I have no idea, actually. I'm just messing with you. Yeah, no, I think...
It wouldn't surprise me if you had to go get a book. I'm fine
exactly.
With that.
What I was like, we talk about trauma, and did I mention trauma? We talked about that too.
Right.
So Yeah, so we talk about, can trauma be redeemed? We talk about overcoming what we call the triplets: guilt, shame, and regret, which are three different things, and how those play into trauma. We talk about, how those work. We talk about grieving well and grieving like God grieves, and how to process that. We talk about how pride is an inhibitor to healing, how vulnerability is a superpower. We talk about identity. We unpack 3 lies that most veterans or first responders have believed about their identity, why they're not true, but why they lead to things like suicidal ideation. And we uncover those specifically. What else? Yeah, I mean, those are the types of topics. We talk about forgiveness of self and others, those kinds of things. So what we believe are kind of root issues, foundational building block issues.
Can you go back to the perseverance piece? I was just having this conversation this morning about how so often when someone endures trauma of some kind, the loss of a loved one or personal trauma, the first thing they want to do is run away. And that run away can be very reasoned, it can be very articulate, it can look really good from the outside, but in their heart, they're running away. But there is a need to persevere, and medication sometimes prevents perseverance. Because they never have to deal with the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, etc. But the importance of perseverance, I haven't heard it put exactly that way, but just continuing, leaning in. Don't run away until you've got some of these things figured out.
That's it. No, I mean, that's exactly it, right? I mean, it's Paul says that we rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces, I think it's character produces hope, in that order. And I think when we look at that, we talk about the default response to trauma is this, the default, meaning if intentionality isn't applied, what we naturally do, default, is we deny that it's going to have any impact on us. We cry, meaning we throw a big hissy fit at how unfair life is, and we get all sad and angry and we blame, and then we numb. So we turn to either legal or illegal or destructive things, and then we run, because eventually the numbing agent wears off. So then we begin running away. We run to isolate ourselves. We run away from our problems. We run away from whatever. And those are the 4 things is we deny, cry, numb, and run. And I would say that all of us listening, even non-veterans, this is the default response to trauma. And it doesn't result in life. It results in death. It doesn't result in hope. It results in despair. And so for us, we do just that. Perseverance is the necessity. It is the vehicle by which hope is produced. Without perseverance, hope is impossible, which, not getting off on a tangent, but I am quickly, is just, we have a hope void. We have a hope issue in culture today. And I believe one of the reasons is that life has become easy enough. We've found so many crutches to help people not have to actually persevere through what they're going through. They've been able to numb themselves so much that it's counterintuitive. But we think the way to help people get more help is reduce the strain and reduce the stress of life and simplify their life and make things easier for them. But it's actually the contrary. Hope is actually found through helping them overcome more things, to actually help them become more victorious, because that begets more hope when they realize, I did this, so now I can do this. Because perseverance stacks on top of itself as we gain more character, as we gain more confidence. And I think that's one of the issues we're seeing in culture as a whole, is people don't know how to find hope because we don't know how to persevere anymore. We blame, we get mad, we cry, we pout, we medicate, and we avoid.
Man, that's great. Man, so well put. How do you communicate to someone who is overwhelmed and wants to run away that they need to persevere? There is a difference between emotion and truth, but emotion, how you feel, can become your truth. And you don't say to someone who's struggling, you shouldn't feel that way, or how you're feeling is wrong. You can't change how someone feels. They do feel that way. How do you communicate to someone who feels like they need to run, or they need to isolate, or they need to push back? How do you communicate to them that really what you need to do is persevere through that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is, again, we lead with grace. So we say, first off, what you're experiencing is common. The majority of us as human beings would do that. So you don't need to be harder on yourself than you are right now, in the sense that, what you're doing is what the majority of us would do.
Right.
So it's normal. So we remove the shame. The second thing is I think we say, and whether or not you accept any of the feedback that I give you right now or not, I want you to know that I love you. I think the world of you, and I want the best for you. So whether that doesn't change, right? So we create a culture of grace there, where that's leading, as opposed to maybe asking questions about their symptoms or diagnosing or prognosing them. I just start with, no matter what happens in our conversation, I care about you.
Yeah.
And that's the second piece. And the third piece is, a lot of times I'll just ask them what they've been doing and if it's been working. And usually the answer is no, it hasn't been. Yeah. And I'll say, okay, well then let's try something different. And, and I think the biggest thing that I think most people, so two things. I think grief is really complicated by design. I think God made grief complicated so that we would have to work through all the difficult emotions that come with it. If there was an easy way through grief, then it would bypass some of those deep healings that happen. Yeah. But I think that most of us are afraid of really big emotions because we're afraid that we might lose control if we start to feel those big emotions.
Right.
And my experience, that's the thing that keeps people from approaching their traumas, is a fear of the big emotions. They just, well, what happens if I fall apart? What if I'm Humpty Dumpty and nobody can put me back together again? Yeah. And I think that's really common. I've felt that a lot of times.
Sure.
So I get it.
Man, that's great. Identity. This is something that we talk about often. I think that
you guys do, Mighty Oaks, you guys do such a good job with identity, I feel like, and ownership of biblical manhood. I feel like you guys do really well in that.
And I really feel like for most of these issues, identity is the issue, even as it relates to suicide and some of these other issues. Is trauma removes your identity, or it becomes your identity, and you need to get back to who you are in Christ. How do you approach the conversation of identity?
Well, so a couple different ways, and then I'll stick to the military culture for now, if that's okay.
Sure.
With the military culture, we talk about it through the lens of the lies that we believe. So we say the three biggest lies are, my best days are in the past, I am what I do, and I am what other people think of me. Those three things are typically somewhere in their suicidal ideations are one or all of those three lies. Maybe the fourth one could be the world would be better off, or my family would be better off without me. That's kind of an optional fourth. And so we have some conversations about why we believe that we are the sum of what we do. This idea that some people believe their actions define their, who they are. Other people believe who they are will define their actions. And so we kind of have a conversation about that and what do they think. And there's this famous Indian philosopher. He's kind of a guru. I don't follow his teachings, but he had this great phrase where he talks about we're actually not one person, but we're three. We're the person that others see, we're the person that we want them to see, and then we're the person that we actually are.
Sure.
And I think that's true.
Yeah.
And so we have that conversation, and it's interesting to see the self-esteem gaps too that usually began years before military service.
Sure. Yeah, I think a lot of what we deal with, I know a lot of what we deal with is not trauma related to the military. It's trauma that was exacerbated by military service that existed long before you ever came into the military.
That's right. It just tore the stitches out.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly right.
Looking at the clock, we're running out of time, so I won't keep asking questions. There's a lot of other questions I'd like to ask. Where did you find the first people that came to your living room to have some of these conversations with you?
Yeah, I don't recommend this, but they were former patients of my wife.
Oh, wow.
She had discharged them months previous, and because they admired her and her therapy had helped them so much. And you got to think she was in this interesting spot where she was, and I better be careful, but there were times she would pray in a clinical setting with people on a military base.
Yeah.
Because they would be weeping in front of her and she didn't know what else to do.
Sure.
And she was moved by compassion to do that. And so I think they felt a connection with her. And so it started off by we wanted to get to know their kids and their wife or their spouse. And so we began by just saying, like, why don't you all come over to the house for dinner?
Yeah,
and we started doing that with so many couples individually that eventually I was like, we should get you all together. And so we just got everybody together. And that was the first group. And I'll never forget, it was two guys named Matt. And one of them was going through a divorce and the other was in a group. And, I mean, it was incredible to see it was just incredible to see the way that God still pursues people, but also the fact that they allowed me to be super uncomfortable and allow me to be super naive in my questions in hindsight, because I didn't know anything about the military. I mean, my dad's a Vietnam veteran, but I didn't know what I know now. And so I said all kinds of things that were dumb. I said, 90% of what I said was dumb, but somehow God moved in spite of it, which is, I guess, good. But yeah, I don't recommend doing exactly the path that Jenny and I did. Also, I don't recommend both of you quitting your job at the same time and going from dual income with no kids to no income and 3 kids over a 3-year period. I don't recommend that either. That's not a super joyful journey.
We learn looking backwards. So yeah, that's great.
Yeah, that's why I had to get pink shirts, man. It's the only ones you can get in sale because nobody wants them.
If that's what you need to tell yourself, then that's fine. Whatever you need to tell yourself, just keep doing it. Okay, so you went from your living room to you guys are all over the country and literally around the world you have groups. Can you talk about that for a minute as we close, and then how people can connect to you guys and get involved in what you're doing?
I mean, we are seeing just a global impact. We're about to announce that we just served. We have had 10,000 people go through our courses now.
That's awesome.
Since the beginning, which is incredible.
Wow, incredible.
But to be honest with you, we feel like a scrappy teenager organization that's still figuring out how to do it. We're not a machine yet. We still, are figuring some things out. I think we've grown quickly enough that it's been some growing pains for us, and we've had to figure things out. But yeah, I mean, we feel like as we move into next year, we're really focused on, we want to serve 50,000 graduates over the next 4 years.
Yeah.
To do that, we need to have about 500 or 600 active course locations around the world. We're already at about 300. We can do that, but we need people to step up and say they want to lead courses and they want to take charge in their own hometown for the 15. They don't have to be responsible for 50,000. They can be responsible for 15 per year. And it multiplies pretty quickly. And so that's what our challenge is. Just please step up and start a course. That's what we need you to do.
Where do you want people to go to find out more information and connect with you guys?
Yeah, rebootrecovery.com.
Rebootrecovery.com. Pretty simple. Evan, appreciate what you guys are doing and what you continue to do.
Thank you guys.
Thanks for your support. Thanks for your help. And we'll just keep plugging away.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening as well, everybody.
Yep. Thanks, man. For those of you that are listening, for those of you that are watching, thank you for doing that. Go check out rebootrecovery.com. And if you are a veteran, you're a first responder in a community that doesn't have something like Reboot, I would encourage you, go check out what they're doing, figure out how you can start something where you are. And that would be a help to you personally, but it'd be a help to those in your community as well. And thankful for the opportunity to push folks toward resources like this one. If we can do anything to help you, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll talk to you next time.